Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Marcello, io gli do la cuffia della lingua 1. Diego, adesso sulla lingua 1 che devo sentire.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this lecture, opening all the lectures focusing on the inexhaustible friendships of this meeting. We will have the opportunity to meet distinguished personalities who, after years, can bear witness of a life that was spent for an ideal, with the grace of faith. And for us, they are real friends to us. Over the next few days, as you've seen from the agenda of the meeting, we will be talking about people that are already very well known in Italy, like Father Lorenzo Milani, Tarashi Nagai, Japanese doctor, and Don Pino Puglisi. Today, we will have the opportunity to talk about Dorothy Day. Maybe it's less known to the Italian audience, but she is very topical and in line with the modern changes that we're witnessing today. And therefore, she is very interesting, as we can see from the fact that there are many of you today in the audience. In 2015, during his visit to the U.S. Congress, Pope Francis talking about 4 examples of distinguished personalities in the American history, together with giants like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Merton, and Martin Luther King, talked about Dorothy Day and her social engagement, her passion for justice and for the cause of the oppressed. Inspired by the gospel, by her faith, and by the example of the saints. Who was Dorothy Day, and why is it interesting to talk about her today? We will be talking about that together with our 3 distinguished guests, whom I thank for being here with us today. Starting to my left with Giulia Galeotti, journalist and author of the cultural pages of the newspaper L'Osservatore Romano. And she is the author of one of the best biographies on Dorothy Day, Siamo, una rivoluzione, Vita di Dorothy Day. Thank you for being here with us. To my right, you will see Robert Ellsberg. He came from the United States. He is a collaborator and curator of the autobiography Dorothy Day, which has just been published by Lev. Ho trovato Dio attraverso I suoi poveri. Maybe someone of you has read on the newspaper Il Corriere the wonderful introduction by Pope Francis. Robert Ellsberg met Dorothy Day in the mid-1970s, and today he will be talking about her, and he will be talking about him meeting her, changing his life. So thank you very much for being here with us, for coming all the way from the United States. And last but not least, Professor Simona Beretta, director of the University Center for the Social Doctrine of the Church, and she is responsible of the journal Dizionario di dottrina sociale della Chiesa. Thank you for being here with us. So, before giving the floor to our three distinguished guests, I'll give you some introductory remarks on the autobiography of Dorothy Day. It's difficult to give just one definition of Dorothy Day. She was a journalist, a writer. She was a radical activist for social rights. She converted to Catholicism. She was a woman of the 20th century living through dramas which are very modern, very topical. Abortion, separation from the man she loved, the fact that she had to grow up a daughter on her own, alone. She was brave enough to tackle the challenges, social and moral challenges of her times. She was a multifaceted, versatile. As Pope Francis wrote in the introduction to the volume, to the book, she is characterized by a deep existential unrest, together with social engagement, which accompanied her throughout her life. And in 1933, in New York, together with the French Peter Maurin, she founded the Catholic Worker Movement, a newspaper, different activities for the promotion of the rights of the poor and the marginalized. In his introduction to the book, Pope Francis talked about the three distinguished aspects of Dorothy Day: the existential unrest, her strong attachment to the church, and service, the works of mercy and service, with which she interpreted the works of mercy of the church, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty. She lived fully, with lots of dramas and lights. And she then moved to Catholicism in her quest for happiness. I will immediately now give the floor to Giulia Galeotti, who will be helping us to talk about Dorothy Day. So who was Dorothy Day? Giulia. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the meeting for focusing on such a multifaceted figure. That was very contradictory. She is not very well known, and not just in Italy. As Francesco recalled, when Pope Francis talked about Dorothy Day during his visit to the U.S. Congress, and that was the first time that a pope talked about a lay woman for the development of the rights of a country. After he spoke, people asked, why did the Pope talked about Dorothy Day? So the story started in April 1906 with a girl of 9 years old looking at the world, but she doesn't understand. It was dawn when the earthquake destroyed the city of San Francisco, and that was a tragedy that marked the life of Dorothy Day. Before the crowd in Berkeley, where she lived with her family, Dorothy saw that her neighbors rolled up their sleeves and shared the little they had with the people fleeing from the city. And so she asked herself, why can the community not take care of its most fragile members? Why is this not a rule? Dorothy Day immediately saw inequalities, and she always thought about those inequalities. If I had to summarize that in a sentence, I would say that she never surrendered to the status quo. She never did that in her long life. She died in 1980 when she was 83, and she was many things together. She was a journalist, an activist, she was anarchic, she was a pacifist, she was a mother and co-founder. 90 years ago, with Peter Maureen, she founded the newspaper, the Catholic Worker, and immediately after that, the Catholic Worker movement that changed the society and the American churches through houses of hospitalities. In May 1933, the first issue of the Catholic Quarter was published. After some point, somebody knocked at the door and said, "I need a bed." And she said, "We don't have any beds." "Why don't you have any beds?" "Because you're talking about hospitality, you're talking about that." So all of a sudden, Dorothy created the first and opened up the first house of hospitality. The people knocking on the door were always the priority of the movement. Even without money, the newspaper wouldn't come out because the hungry had to be fed. When there was no time, the article was not published. During a TV interview in 1971, in very simple terms, she was almost unpolite, Dorothy answered to somebody who was talking to her about and was asking her about the Catholic Worker movement. She said, "Well, if your brother is hungry, you're going to feed him. You're not abandoning him. You're not saying to him, go away." We do it every day, just like individuals and as a society. But she didn't, because beyond the poverty, beyond the aspect of the people knocking on the door, to her, those persons were Jesus. Talking about the life of Dorothy today means a lot. It means going through a journey in the 20th century, meeting all the distinguished personalities like Martin Luther King, Castro, Kennedy, Danilo Dolci, Pope John XXIII. Her life was also a journey in literature. She was friends with Eugene O'Neill, Simona. She read a lot since she was a child, because what we are also depends on what we imagine. Her story also talks a lot about journalism. And if information is not accessible to all, she says, journalism does not pay its service. The Catholic Worker, from its first issue to today, costs 1 cent. Donations are kindly welcome, but the newspaper costs only 1 cent. And if you don't have 1 cent to pay, they're going to give it to you for free. Her life is also an essay of political theory, and this is a paradox because she never voted. She refused politics because politics is very far from the real needs of people. The first time she went to jail, she was picketing in order to fight for female suffrage. Her life is also a reflection about the difference between justice and care. It's a study on different people. It's a poem of the gospel, and it's a guide to the city of New York between the heart of Manhattan and Staten Island water. Dorothy was born in Brooklyn in 1897. She was the third daughter out of 5. Her father was a journalist, a sports journalist, and he was anti-Catholic. He was against the women. It was very bad. Her mother was very important to her throughout her life, even if she was different from her. And she taught her child to tackle the problems of life with a lot of dignity. She followed her father when she was a child. When she was 18, she came back to New York. She came back to New York, and she understood that writing, being a journalist, was her mission. Before those injustices that she has seen, before those inequalities, her mission was to write. And she was recruited by the only socialist newspaper in New York. That was a call. And then she started her life. She drank a lot. She smoked a lot. And she smoked throughout her life. She moved a lot. And when she came out of nightclubs at dawn, she felt attracted to the St. Joseph's Church. as a magnet. She was attracted by the religious poor, by the religiosity of the poor, of the unemployed, of the migrant. So she often went to church after the nightclubs. First World War, there was the Spanish fever. Writing was no longer enough for her, so she became a nurse for 1 year. Then she left her job because she incredibly fell in love with somebody. Maybe. She wrote a lot. She wrote articles, autobiographies, books, diaries, letters. And the diaries and letters have been extraordinarily cured by Ellsberg. So thank you for that. So she wrote a lot about herself. There are many aspects of her life on which she didn't say anything. So going through her life means putting together all the different pieces of the puzzle. So she fell in love with a man. She fell in love with Lionel Moyes, who was a volcanic journalist. He was very dynamic. He was a benchmark for Hemingway. And so she lived alone. She was writing a lot. And since Moyes wanted her woman to stay at home, she left everything and she stayed at home until she found out that she was pregnant. But he was clear. He didn't want to get married. He didn't want to have children. He didn't want just to have one woman. Well, whereas Dorothy wanted this child. And she wanted that child because she was madly in love with this man. She wanted to create a family. But she knew with great disappointment that the only option for her was illegal abortion. So when she decided to say that, he said to her, I'm going to leave to Venezuela. So he said, okay, I'm going to come up and meet you after the abortion. But she didn't do that. She came back by taxi, and she found a note on her table that he wrote. So you did what many women have been doing for a century. I hope that you're going to find somebody else in your life. And soon after, she got married. She got married with a rich man. She left, and for 1 year, she came to Europe, 6 months in Capri. And so she was married to a man that she didn't love. And there she wrote the love story of the man that she loved. When she came back, she was ashamed of this marriage. So she left this man. The book was published. The book was not wonderful in literary terms, but I'm telling you that because the life of such extraordinary women can also be very practical. And the cinema rights of this book, the film was never done. The 11th Virgin, that was the title of the film. And so she sold the cinema rights, and she bought with that money a small house in Staten Island. She fell in love again of Foster Bethlehem, a man that was very important to her in her life because she came closer to nature. She had been grown up in city, but she fell in love with nature. She found out that she was pregnant. He didn't want to have children, but she respected the individual freedoms, and so he had a different reaction. Dorothy, in the meantime, had changed, so she didn't want to give up this pregnancy, although it was unexpected. And so she felt a joy. She was 29. She was very happy for this pregnancy. And she wrote that this joy was so deep, so profound, that it couldn't be just human. There was something more to that. And so she was very happy for the birth of her first and only daughter, Tamara. So she christened her daughter, and then she got christened herself. But after her baptism, she gave up a lot of her life. And so the 5 most difficult years of her existence, of her life, started. She became a Catholic. She got christened. And to her, that meant giving up to the man of her life. Because Bergamo didn't want to get married. He was an anarchic. He didn't believe in the relations before God, before an authority. And then she wrote letters, and she will continue to beg him to get married to her. Think about this girl who did a lot, who wrote a lot. She went through the streets in New York, and she begged him to be married by him. And she continued to do that even when he had another girlfriend. So these 5 years were very difficult because she had to give up the love of her life because she wanted to get married. Otherwise, it wouldn't be consistent with her faith. And then she had to give up all her friends. So if you get to a church sometimes, maybe people can think that you are strange enough. But then she had a lot of communist, socialist, anarchic friends. And so it was totally different to be converted to Catholicism, to the church. And somebody told her, you have to go to a shrink because this conversion is too much. But she loved to stay with other people. And therefore, she no longer had friends. Dorothy's conversion was not the conversion of a woman that had met a Christian community. The only Catholic that she knew was the baker. And she wouldn't talk about gospel and spirituality to the baker. So to her, getting converted to the Catholic Church was something strange and something totally new. She did a lot of jobs. She worked even as a real estate agent. After 5 years, she came back to New York, and with her and Tamar, the youngest brother, and his wife went to live with her because all of a sudden, Dorothy today had something to leave her daughter to. So she came back to the street, to the road. She continued to work as a journalist, and she followed the hunger march for the unemployed in Washington. And while she was marching together with these desperate men and women, she realized that all people were there. There were anarchists, communists, socialists, but not Catholics. And that was very painful to her because these men and women had been betrayed by Christianity. Before going back home, she went to pray to the Catholic University, and she prayed God to send her a signal. What do I have to do with my life, with my faith, with my mission? And when she came back home, she found a man waiting for her. He was very badly dressed. Understanding what God wants for us is not that easy. And soon after, on the 1st of May, the first issue of the Catholic Worker was published in 1,500 copies. And after a few years, 250,000 copies were published. And 3 years later, there were 33 houses of hospitality all around the United States. This man in front of her was Peter Moraine. Two people that were very different, absolutely different. She was 36, he was 20 years older, she was American, he was French, he was a farmer, he couldn't organize anything, but the two of them had a common goal, as in to make a peaceful community and green revolution, focusing on 3 aspects. The publication of a newspaper in order to convey a message to everyone, the opening of houses of hospitality for the people in need, to make the works of mercy, and to create farmhouses. The life of Dorothy today is very rich. she lived in close relations with nature. She always tried to strike a balance with nature. Nature is not a victim to be protected. Nature is what is owning us. We're not human beings in nature, but we are human beings living among other human beings. So economic growth is not the solution. Economic growth is the problem. What we need is cultural growth, growth in human relations. So we need to tackle the problems of modernity by offering a prayer, by offering a solution. She was very calm, but she, at one point she said, and she wrote on the Catholic Worker, we have the solution. All these issues were very dear to her even before her conversion. The poor and poverty was the first emergency for her. The United States was very poor in terms of spirituality, in terms of values. Fight against poverty is different from the fight against the poor. The poor had to be seen. And then she was interested in peace. Peace to Dorothy Day was very practical. Don't kill is her motto. Don't kill, even if on the other side you have the evil Adolf Hitler. So during the Second World War, the movement risked the collapse. Peace to Dorothy Day was not just to make war, but a practice to live every day. And work which is not employment, but is a mission, the refusal of segregation, the fight against Semitism, the fight against jail. What is the objective of people being in jail? The fil rouge of her life was the fact that she opposed the violence in society. Silly Grossman made a difference between the desperation oppressing you and making you breathless, and another one which doesn't make you breathless, doesn't oppress you, doesn't come all of a sudden, but changes you from the inside. So this desperation, bit by bit, marked the existence, and Dorothy Day engaged for her life. What is the answer to that? The community. The fact of being together, the fact of living together. How can a community be created? First of all, by writing. Words are essential in order to create a common ground. Working together, making friends with everyone. We exist in the relations with the other. There's a wonderful sentence by Dorothy Day saying, we are a community, them is a crowd. To many extent, Dorothy Day came before the Second Vatican Council because she was focusing on the poor, because she talked about the existence of the layman, and she recognized the existence of faith. She anticipated many of the issues concerning social justice that became important for the Church. However, the story of Dorothy Day is much more than that. Goes beyond the poor and the marginalized. It is also the story of a mother and a daughter. And maybe I'll go back to that later on. To conclude, Dorothy Day ran a great risk. For the people who just want to remember the fact that she was a rebel, and also the risk of trivializing Dorothy Day. We cannot tame such a woman because she was very complex. She was saying, don't call me a saint because I don't want to be forgotten that easily. So she wanted to change the perspective on herself. as soon as she became famous. But this sentence does not represent her. Dorothy Day paid respect, and she felt a great esteem for the saints. Saints make us think, saints were important to her when she was young. The saints were important and revolutionary. As for the canonization process, she didn't want to go to the pedestal. She was convinced that anyone could do her job, but I believe that she could be a great saint. She could revitalize the church in a very important way. When God asked where Abel was, Cain said, "Am I the guardian of my brother?" And Dorothy Day said, "Yes, we are the guardians of our brothers." David Levine, in January 1971, made this drawing. Levine drew Dorothy Day while she was climbing. This woman really translated in life her pilgrimage, her walking on the mountain. The mountain must be here and now and never has to be forgotten.
Grazie.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Giulia Galeotti. So, in the beginning, I mentioned Ho trovato Dio attraverso I suoi poveri. Pope Francis, in the introduction, writes, "The life of Dorothy Day is one of the possible confirmation of what Pope Benedict XVI stated with strength, and something that I repeated many times. So the church grows through attraction and not through proselytism." So the tale of the conversion by Dorothy Day tells us that it's not through tricks that you can get people close to the church, but it's the grace that is triggered by charity. So debuting, coming from witnesses, so love through concrete gestures. So now I ask Robert Ellsberg, whom I thank once again for his presence. You met Dorothy since the mid-70s, and you were a collaborator of hers, and so you also bear the testimony. You are a witness of this story that we heard from Giulia Galeotti. So now we're listening to you. So please share your experience with Dorothy Day and so your encounter with her. Thank you.
Much. Hope you're hearing me. Good. I'm so honored to be in this extraordinary meeting and to see that Dorothy Day's story is being shared with you. I think a great saint of our time, and also the person who changed my life. If you are not familiar with Dorothy Day, you should not feel so bad, because I think when Pope Francis spoke before Congress in the United States in 2015 and named Dorothy Day among the 4 great Americans around which he organized his speech, I can guarantee you that most of the members of Congress had no idea who he was talking about. I think afterwards some of them were wondering why the Pope was talking about Doris Day, if you know who that is, actress with Rock Hudson in romantic comedies in the 1950s. Those who were familiar with the name Dorothy Day would know that she was not always called a great American, that for most of her life, she was more likely to be called a communist, un-American, a subversive, even a heretic, certainly someone whose name was not likely to be mentioned in Congress. But I was among the people watching on television whose heart leapt when I heard Pope Francis cite her, saying, "I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day." who founded the Catholic worker movement. And he cited her social activism, her passion for justice and the cause of the oppressed, which he said were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. In referring to Dorothy Day as a servant of God, he was acknowledging the fact that her cause for canonization is currently in process. Of course, as you have heard, if she is named Saint Dorothy, she will be a saint with a very unusual backstory, having renounced Christianity in her youth and spent her early years as a journalist and activist for radical causes. Among canonized saints, she would probably be unique for having been arrested on numerous occasions. Her friends were anarchists, communists, left-wing writers and artists. As you heard, in the aftermath of an unhappy love affair, she had an abortion, after which she apparently tried to commit suicide on 2 occasions. None of this certainly is standard fare for the lives of the saints. And yet there was always in Dorothy Day a yearning for the transcendent. Like a character in Dostoevsky, she observed, "All my life I've been haunted by God." Yet I think it's significant that even the circumstances of her conversion were unusual. In fact, I would say unique in the annals of the saints, prompted by the experience of pregnancy and the birth of her daughter. As you heard, this occurred while she was living on Staten Island with a man she deeply loved. And after years of strife and unhappiness, this experience of love and what she called natural happiness turned her heart to the possibility of a greater happiness to be obtained from life. When she became pregnant, she found herself wishing to have her child baptized in the Catholic Church, a step she would follow, though it meant a wrenching separation from her partner. As an anarchist, he would have nothing to do with marriage. It got to the point, she said, where it was literally a choice between God and man. She made her choice, but it was bought, she said, with her heart's blood. Apart from the loss of her partner, there was another loss. Her conversion also felt like a painful betrayal of the working class. She believed the Catholic Church was the church of the poor, but to her radical friends, and sadly to her as well, it seemed more like a friend of the rich. She knew nothing about Catholic social teaching. She was literally at a loss as to how she might reconcile her faith and her loyalty to the cause of the oppressed. The seeds of this dilemma went back much further. Even as a young child, Dorothy recognized the need for a new type of saint. In her memoir, she described her first childhood encounters with the lives of the saints, recalling how her heart was stirred by stories of their charity toward the sick, the maimed, the leper. But she said, there was another question in my mind. Why was so much done in remedying the evil instead of avoiding it in the first place? Where were the saints to try to change the social order, not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery? In effect, Dorothy's vocation, slow down. Dorothy's vocation took form around this challenge. Her conversion to Catholicism and her work in founding the Catholic Worker came many years later. But the great underlying mission of her life was to join the practice of charity with the struggle for justice and peace. Thereby, she invented a model of holiness that didn't really exist before. Because of Dorothy, future generations of Christians would not have to ask her question, where were the saints to try to change the social order? It was a question she answered with her own life. I won't tell the whole story of her prayer in Washington, which you've heard about. She prayed for her vocation, that she would find a way to combine her faith with her commitment to social justice, and how she returned to New York again to find Peter Moore waiting for her. He had been trying to devise a synthesis, a way of expressing the radical teachings of the gospel and to set that into motion. And he found his vehicle, his partner, in Dorothy Day. I think that Peter's great contribution was sort of to give her permission to start her own movement. Drawing on the lives of the saints, he showed it wasn't necessary to wait for anyone to authorize or sponsor the way of discipleship. The saints began immediately with whatever means were at hand, and if God blessed the venture, the means would arrive. So she started the Catholic Worker newspaper. It was launched on May 1st, 1933, 90 years ago. Rather than just agitate about social injustice, articles in the Catholic Worker described what society would look like if it were organized around values of solidarity, community, friendship, human dignity, instead of selfishness and greed. Dorothy believed it was not enough to write about these ideas. They must live them out. So this led to the houses of hospitality for the practice of the works of mercy. Dorothy spent the rest of her life in such communities. At the same time, she believed it was not enough just to care for the poor. It was also necessary to challenge, protest, and resist the structures that caused such poverty and the need for charity. Many people were confounded by her ability to integrate a traditional style of Catholic piety with a radical style of social engagement, but there was no paradox in her eyes. The basis of the synthesis was found in the central doctrine of the faith, the Incarnation. Her subsequent mission was rooted in the radical social implications of this doctrine. God entered our humanity and our history so that all creation was hallowed. Whatever we did for our neighbors, we did directly for him. This was the bedrock teaching of Jesus. I was hungry and you fed me. Insofar as you did these things to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did for me. But she took this even more radically in the direction of her commitment to gospel nonviolence. If Christ was present in the disguise of our neighbors, if our salvation rested on whether we fed them, then surely we should not kill them. She pursued this position of gospel nonviolence throughout her life. It was her most controversial position. Many people felt it was folly. During the 1950s, during the Cold War, she was repeatedly arrested for refusing to cooperate with mandatory civil defense drills, which she considered dress rehearsals for doomsday. Most Catholic leaders thought this was probably foolish, but she felt that the preparation for nuclear war was what was actually crazy, if not blasphemous. She believed in the power hidden in small gestures. She drew surprising inspiration from her favorite saint, Thérèse of Lisieux, the young Carmelite nun who died at the age of 24 in her convent in Normandy, and who called her spirituality the little way, performing all the small gestures and encounters of daily life in a spirit of love and in the presence of God. In this way, she believed that all of our everyday offered opportunities for patience, forgiveness, compassion, and this would be the arena for holiness. Everyday life provided the means for sanctification. And she believed strongly in the mystical body of Christ, so that each sacrifice endured in love, each work of mercy could contribute to the balance of love in the world. Dorothy believed that Saint Thérèse was a great saint for our time, who spoke to the power of things that are marginal and of little account, She appreciated the social implications of Teresa's teaching, the significance of all the little things we do or fail to do, including the protests we make or fail to make. In the Gospel, this is illustrated by the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. I believe that Dorothy's application of Teresa's little way to the social arena is one of the most significant aspects of her witness. She summed it up in the line, "The greatest challenge of the day is this: how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution that begins with each one of us." I was 19 when I first went to the Catholic Worker. In 1975, Dorothy was 77. I was struck by how much interest she took in me and young people, and her ability to see our possibilities and talents that we didn't know we had. After just a few months, she asked me to be the managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper, a task for which I had no evident qualifications, but that pointed me in the direction of my life's vocation. Through her writings, which I edited, I came to know and understand better how her spirituality was expressed in the ordinary, everyday encounters of daily life. I entitled her diaries "The Duty of Delight," and this pointed to an important theme of Dorothy, the importance of the will. She believed that delight, like love, is a matter of discipline, a matter of the will. It's one thing to feel delight when things are delightful, or to love people who are lovable, but the heart of the gospel is adding love even when there is no love, loving the person beside us, even if that person is disagreeable. That didn't mean that this was any easier for Dorothy than the rest of us, but it was the exercise of charity in these small ways that equipped her for the extraordinary and heroic actions she performed on a wider stage. Dorothy had a great eye for beauty. She liked to quote Dostoevsky, "The world will be saved by beauty." And that didn't just mean it'll be saved by pretty things, flowers or sunsets. It meant looking beyond the surface of things in their ultimate dimension and allowing our hearts to be moved and ennobled by this deeper truth. It meant moving beyond the merely aesthetic sense of beauty to the compelling power of goodness embodied in the saints and those who sacrificed themselves in the cause of justice. I want to mention one other thing, surprising to some people, because she looks very serious in her photographs. And that is how much fun it was to be with her. She had a tremendous sense of humor, a girlish laugh. And when you were with Dorothy, you felt that you wanted to be a better person, and that you could be a better person, and that it would be tremendous adventure to be a better person. And I think that's probably the way people responded to St. Francis and many other saints. As Giulia mentioned, she didn't really like to be called a saint, if that meant being put on a pedestal. But she believed that we are all called to be saints. That just meant putting off the old person and putting on Christ, conforming ourselves to the pattern of the gospel, something that didn't occur once and for all, but was the journey of a lifetime. In his speech before Congress, Pope Francis spoke of these four great Americans in terms that could apply to our understanding of the saints. He said, "Such figures help us to see and interpret reality in a new way." That Pope Francis should highlight Dorothy Day was in many ways not surprising. It's hard to think of any other Catholic of recent times who so fully embodied his gospel vision with its emphasis on mercy, the desire for a poor church for the poor, his challenge to the culture of indifference, his condemnation of a market economy that kills, his call to touch the wounds of Christ in those at the margins and peripheries. His deep commitment to peace and care for creation, his teachings on social friendship and solidarity, and his strategy for change with a focus on the slow, patient task of planting seeds. Dorothy always brought such aspirations down to the basic personal level. She concluded her autobiography with this line: "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. It all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on." Grazie.
Grazie Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Now, we'll continue this journey. We talked about community, social friendship, characterized by charity, peace and justice. This is a dynamic of love leading to the implementation of the works of mercy. Just like what is said in a letter, the faith without the works of mercy is dead. This faith becoming works of mercy, social construction, mixes and mingles with the events of the world, starting from the poorest and the most marginalized. Now, Simona Beretta. We have already heard a lot about Dorothy today. What can you add to that? What is the contribution of Dorothy today? Thank you. First of all, thank you to Giulia and Robert because they really told a story, a real story, a practical story, lasting over the time and over the years. That is inexhaustible, that continues after the life of Dorothy today. In my own personal experience, Dorothy today is a name that I heard pronounced when I was a child. I don't remember who pronounced it, probably by an uncle of mine, a priest. And then I heard this name again when I had just joined the Communion and Liberation Movement, and I was in high school. I had to go to the United States. That was 1971, and an older friend of mine took me to the Yucca book, and I had a conversation that really struck me. I was told, yeah, you have to do two things while you're away. At a time where you will not have the community taking care of you. Every day, you have to remember liturgy and faith and try and meet the people from the Catholic worker movement. I did the first thing. Maybe I didn't try to do the second one. I didn't manage to do anything to meet these people, but I'm very affectionate. I feel very close to Dorothy today. That is very peculiar, a very peculiar person that could combine two things that I've had always in my heart: the certainty of faith and the awareness that this faith leads to a social presence that can revolutionize and change reality and the world. So I read a bit about her. I was not too much convinced at the beginning. And then in 2016, at last, I met a small community of the Catholic workers in Southend in a beautiful house that needed to be repainted. There were some men living there. There was a vegetable garden in the backyard. There were some onions growing. And That was the real example of an hospitality that meant sharing. Voluntary poverty, the ability to share and the ability to change. Then I was invited to come to the meeting, and I started reading Dorothy today seriously, and I have to be honest, that I continued reading about her, and I'm always thinking about her. She was a person that was able to transform the life of people meeting her. So, in my short speech, I want to talk about her directly. Dorothy today is still able to explain the beauty, the meaning, and the value of the social doctrine of the Church. I know that you don't like the word doctrine, but doctrine meaning thinking, meaning speech. This social doctrine of the Church is the point on which Dorothy and Peter Moran, and they didn't have anything in common, as you've heard before. And this is the point on which they met. I'm going to read to you the first, just a bit of an excerpt of the first issue of the Catholic Worker, May 1933. To whom is this newspaper addressed? For those people who don't think they have a future, for the unemployed of the Great Depression after the crisis of 1929. This newspaper is addressed to the people who think that their sufferings are not acknowledged. This small newspaper, is addressed to these people. It is printed in order to draw their attention on the fact that the Catholic Church has a social agenda, to let them know that there are men of God, men and women of God, who take action, not just for their spiritual health, but also for their wealth. At last, we have a Catholic newspaper for the unemployed. In the attempt to circulate the encyclicals of the Pope on social justice and the programs of the Church to rebuild the social order, this new newspaper, The Catholic Worker, is now published. So, we see it in the DNA of the movement, which consists of houses of hospitality, a newspaper, different attempts of having farm universities. It's a fascinating story. It's an extraordinary story, which is as interesting as a novel. So the social doctrine of the Church is in the DNA of this movement, of this newspaper. Dorothy Day embodies the social doctrine of the Church because the social doctrine of the Church, as was said by Pope John Paul II, is a tradition where the actions of people are embodied. And as things become old and offer an opportunity to enrich people's life and faith, this is also connected to the fecundity of men and women who made an effort to inspire to the Church to act for the world, to act individually or in group. They have created a big movement for the defense of human beings and to protect their dignity, which, through history, contributed to creating a juster society and to put constraints, to put limits to injustice. The Church is made of strange people, as well as the teachings of the Church. It is not a system of ideas, but it is the critical and systematic reflection on an experience made of works, on all people's answers to the normal provocations of life, social and personal life, because even personal life also has a social dimension. So in this great movement for the defense of human beings, in the social doctrine of the Church, there is a movement. And the people grow with the social doctrine, and the social doctrine enlightens and accompanies the people. It's a movement, it's a dance, where you can also stumble and fall down, but it gives you joy. It gives you the meaning of life. It gives you the duty of joy, which is not just euphoria, but it is passion for what is human, lasting over the time. It is a passion that grows continuously. Reading the last years of Dorothy Day's life, where she traveled by bus here and there to visit houses, to write, to prepare soups. This gives us joy. Only by reading Dorothy Day you can understand what joy is, so I suggest you to read her writings. The desire for justice and of dignity for everyone, even for the unemployed and for the poor during the Great Depression, is a problem that changed shape, but poverty and inequalities today are still topical. They are still true. So, Dorothy Day didn't talk about the creation of a social organization. She talked about solidarity. She didn't talk about charity, but she turned the poor into protagonists. There is no other solution. Pope Francis also said that in his speech to the United Nations in 2015. What is fundamental for sustainable development is that people becomes agents full of dignity, agents of their own development. Hence, employment, labor is important. And this leads us back to the title of the Catholic worker, work. Employment is at the heart of everything. And Dorothy Day was a pioneer in that context. John Paul II said that work is the key of the social issue. And when you read Dorothy Day talking about work and employment, what she wrote in June 1931 in The Catholic Worker, you understand that this is not just related to material conditions, but this is what John Paul II in Labora and Exercems called the subjective dimension of work. He said, Dorothy Day said and wrote, not only are we talking about the need of a trade union for all workers, but we are repeatedly underlining the dignity of work, the dignity of the person who is made up of body and soul, who is made resemblant to God and the Holy Spirit. These things, these words were written on a radical newspaper. And this underlies our fight to the routine work in factories. This is what we want for workers. We want to promote sharing. Workers have to become owners of themselves. This doesn't have anything to do with wages and salaries and working hours, but men have to become responsible for their work and have to become owner of their work. And this is in line with the principles of the 21st century. Now, talking about work, I'll just give you another example, quoting Dorothy today. The Catholic worker talked about many issues, including a trade union dispute concerning workers and undertakers of the Calvary Cemetery in New York. Because Dorothy Day thought that the social doctrine of the church was for everyone. She was sure and positive about that. So the social doctrine of the church was explained on a newspaper addressed to the unemployed, a radical newspaper addressed to the unemployed. When there was a strike of the maritime workers in 1936, the Catholic worker movement rented an area, rented a space where the strikers could go to take shelter. And Dorothy Day was very happy, and she wrote, "We have to buy another 100 encyclicals." And this word was for the poor. So the social doctrine was for the poor and also for the principles, for the princes of the church, because the trade union dispute on the cemetery concerned the Cardinal of New York of that time. Dorothy Day wrote, addressing to the Cardinal and telling the Cardinal, I saw the reports describing how you involved the future priests in digging the graves in order to fight against the strikers. And you know that we are supporting the strikers, but I'm writing to you because this small strike is very significant. It's not that the people have to say, look, they love one another. Here we're offering a show whereby people are making fun of us. This has nothing to do with the salaries and working hours. This is a question of dignity of the workers and the possibility that they can show their claims. They can show their bitterness. They are asking for salaries like those mentioned by the popes in their encyclicals. Salaries whereby workers can educate their children, can save, can buy a house, can educate their children. You are a prince of the church, she wrote, a great man. To the eyes of these small, poor strikers who are workers working hard, with hard hands, full of resentment. They only want to talk to you. Please, with all my heart, I'm begging you, go and see them like a father to their children. This is not a delicate message, but this is a message full of desire for the church to become what it has to be, a space where people love one another, where people can live like brothers and sisters. And I think that this is a great teaching of Dorothy Day, one of the many teachings of Dorothy Day. So I was really enthusiastic by her story. I invite all of you who want to read about something extraordinary to read her writings. I recall you that the social doctrine of the church is a sort of movement where people feel that the doctrine, and the doctrine helps the people. And here we see a passion for man, a passion for freedom, in its greatest expression, a possibility for all of us to be protagonists and to own our work, so that if we cannot eliminate injustice, at least we can limit injustice. Thank you.
Nel concludere questo incontro io desidero ringraziare Giulia, Robert, Simona, perché penso che abbiamo avuto l'occasione di vedere sotto i nostri occhi questa possibilità che anche nel 2023, nel nostro mondo occidentale, è possibile ancora vivere per un ideale, come ci ha testimoniato attraverso le vostre parole la testimonianza di Dorothy Day questa sera. Vivere per un ideale, che vuol dire piangere e amare. La vita di Dorothy è stato entrambe le cose, gioire e soffrire, sognare e lottare per costruire qualcosa di buono per sé e per gli altri, a partire dai più poveri e dagli emarginati. E si vede così accadere questa amicizia sociale che è uno spettacolo. E cito l'ultima frase dalla prefazione di Papa Francesco del volume più volte richiamato, dove a un certo punto il Papa scrive: «Il Signore brama cuori inquieti, non anime borghesi che si accontentano dell'esistente. Dio non toglie niente all'uomo e alla donna di ogni tempo, dà soltanto il centuplo». Penso che questo pomeriggio, grazie ai nostri relatori, abbiamo avuto un assaggio, un tentativo, una possibilità che ciascuno di noi può continuare a percorrere in tanti modi che sono stati anche suggeriti. E un tentativo di questa amicizia sociale lo abbiamo davanti agli occhi. È un tentativo che è quello del meeting, che nasce con questo scopo e con questa possibilità. Una possibilità di incontro e di approfondimento e di amicizia.
A possibility of getting to know other people, and the easiest way is to have the meeting keep existing through the Dona Ora, Donate Now desks. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very fruitful and good continuation at the meeting. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli. Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea. Innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.